In early August of 1962, John Gosvig, pictured on the right, and myself got a check from Mrs. Haynes to help us go to race at Bonneville. Anyone that's ever been to Bonneville knows that it takes hours and hours and hours of preparation to get ready to go to Bonneville. This engine was actually born in 1958. It was a 36 horse engine, of course, with an Okrasa kit on it. The engine actually went through several hands. Naturally, I owned it first. Then George Carter bought it, and he is in a picture later. And finally, John Gosvig, who's doing the welding here, purchased the car that this engine went in. Now, I'm not really sure if he ever purchased the engine or not. I kind of don't think so, because I think George Carter blew the engine up and I bought it back. So I think that when we went to Bonneville, John owned the car and I owned the engine. Not only was it necessary to prepare the VW to go to Bonneville, but it was also necessary to prepare the Corvair, which towed the trailer that hauled the Volkswagen to Bonneville. Although we thought we were totally prepared for the trip, we broke the trailer on the way to Bonneville, and we stopped at this little town, and this guy in this welding shop was good enough to help us out and do some welding on the trailer. Although we were from Sacramento, the heat was just about more than we could take sometimes, and it was more than once we stopped for refreshments of one kind or another. And here you can see us all eating a great big delicious watermelon. And that's my wife Nita right behind me, and my son Mike is over to the left. Nick is between Mike and I, and that's our daughter Teresa. I would have been 33, Nita would have been 30, Mike 12, Nick 8, and Teresa 6. And like I say, we stopped more than once for refreshments. It was very necessary. Now, I'm not quite sure that this restaurant is actually at Bonneville, but if it isn't, it sure is very close to Bonneville. However, this is Bonneville, because this is the motel that we stayed in for one long week. Now, George Carter is the one with his hand over his eyes. Cliff was one of the mechanics that worked at Haynes Motors with John and I, and John Gosvig has his back to the camera. I don't know who is standing behind Cliff, but that probably is my wife Nita. George Carter, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the owners of the engine. In fact, I think he may have owned it a couple of different times. The next morning early, we arrived at Bonneville Salt Flats and saw this magnificent sign, which anyone that's ever been there would, I think, agree with me. A little later, we arrived at the gates, which I don't think there's actually any gates there, as I recall. And this was one of our first inspectors that we met. Now here evidently is another one of our inspectors, and we're now inside the gate putting on the number that was designated to us. Now here's our bug with the numbers all on it. I know we were class F, and the TS is probably something like Touring Sports. 1954 bug, ready to race, with a 36 horse Okrasa Volkswagen air-cooled engine. normally aspirated. Mike, sitting in the driver's seat, is our son, and he was 12 at the time, and he is 54 now. There is probably about 100 slides altogether. Some not necessarily have much to do with Bonneville racing itself, but this is one good example of how everyone was there to help. This is of course the Firestone tent, and they probably changed tires for us 3 or 4 times during the week to see if we could get another mile an hour